Make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel to receive notifications when new contents are posted in the future. The links to the documents mentioned in this video can be found in the description of this video below. Richard Carrier is a famous atheist who has criticized my defense of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. After I posted a document showing that he has committed at least 20 errors in his criticisms, he posted a second article in reply. That article turns out to be the worst piece of writing on the Kalam Cosmological Argument I have ever read. Almost every paragraph contains an error. I identified 43 errors in the article and did an interview with Cameron Bertuzzi at Capturing Christianity, highlighting Carrier's top errors. Carrier later replied to this interview with a video he did with Godless Engineer, titled Dr. Richard Carrier versus Dr. Andrew Loke, Kalam Cosmological Argument Failure. However, instead of successfully refuting my argument, Carrier committed another additional 27 errors and reached a total of 90 errors. I shall now explain some of his errors, starting from number 64, counting from the previous 63 errors he has committed. For the first 34 minutes of their video, Carrier did not quote and reply to what I actually said. At 34 minutes, 40 seconds, they played a video clip where I presented a summary of my modus tollens argument for the causal principle, whatever begins to exist has a cause. I have explained this modus tollens argument to Carrier multiple times in our previous interaction. Let me now explain it using a simple illustration. Suppose you ask why it is that I am a human being rather than a lion. Obviously, the circumstances in our world are compatible with lions existing, so why am I not a lion? The answer is quite simple. My parents are human beings. If my parents were lions, I would not be a human being. What this illustrates is that what begins to exist is an effect that is dependent on its cause. My beginning of existence is determined by the properties of my father's sperm and my mother's egg. If the causes were different, e.g., if my parents were not humans, I would have been different. However, if something begins without any cause whatsoever, this means that there would be no cause that determines the effect. For example, if I, a human being, begin uncaused, this means that there would be no cause that makes it the case that only a human being begins to exist uncaused rather than, say, a lion. Moreover, the properties of a human being and the properties of a lion, which differentiate between them in the concrete world, would only be had by them when they had already begun to exist. Whatever difference between that human being and that lion would only exist when they have already begun to exist. What this means is that there would be no difference between them before they began to exist, such that only a human rather than a lion began to exist uncaused. Since there would be no such difference, they would be the same where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. This implies that, if something begins uncaused, other things would also begin uncaused as well. We would observe many other kinds of things: lions, tigers, elephants, increasing in strength of electric fields around you, etc., beginning uncaused around us, and our world would be utterly chaotic, which is not the case. Therefore, it is not the case that something began uncaused. To state the argument formally, premise 1. If something X begins uncaused, then Y, which begins, or could begin, to exist around us, would also begin uncaused. The three reasons which jointly imply the truth of premise 1 are as follows. 1. If X begins uncaused, this means that there would not be any causally antecedent condition which make it the case that only X, rather than Y, begins uncaused. 2. The properties of X and the properties of Y, which differentiate between them in the concrete world, would be had by them only when they had already begun to exist. And 3. The circumstance around us is compatible with the beginning of Y. For example, it is compatible with a rapid increase in strength of electric fields around me, which happens when I switch on the electric field generator. 1, 2, and 3 jointly imply that there would be no difference between X and Y where beginning to exist, uncaused, is concerned. This implies that if something X begins uncaused, then Y, for example, a rapid increasing in strength of electric fields around me, would also begin to exist without cause, for example, without having to switch on the electric field generator. Premise 2. It is not the case that Y begins uncaused, e.g., we don't experience a sudden increasing in strength of electric field begin uncaused around us and killing us. 3. Therefore, it is not the case that something begins uncaused. Since the premises are true and the deduction is valid, we know that the conclusion is true. What this implies is that whatever begins to exist is dependent on the cause to make it the case that it is X rather than Y that begins to exist. We shall call this the causal principle. Now, Carrier responded at 36 minutes 45 seconds of their video by saying, "I'm sure a lot of the audience are confused already. This is really confusing, hard to follow." However, he does not explain what exactly is confusing or hard to follow concerning the 3 reasons I presented. In the rest of the 2-hour-long video, he simply ignored the 3 reasons and did not respond specifically to them. Hence, he has failed to rebut my argument. Moreover, in the rest of the video, at multiple places, Carrier just literally repeats his arguments, which I have already refuted with the 3 reasons mentioned above. And he doesn't respond to my refutation. He's just literally repeating himself over and over and over. In other places, Carrier makes arguments which reveal further errors in his thinking. For example, at 38 minutes of the video, Carrier claims now he Locke is confusing a bit between inductive and deductive logic because maybe you got something wrong about the hypothesis. Maybe there's something wrong with your instruments, and so on. There's a variety of ways that the Tollens can fail that are inductively related. In reply, Carrier fails to note that the premises of my modus tollens argument follows from the meaning of the terms. Reasons 1 and 2 are based on what it means to say that something begins uncaused, and immediate experience. Reason 3 is based on our immediate and undeniable experience that some events do happen around us, which imply that the circumstance around us is compatible with their existence, while premise 2 is based on your immediate and undeniable experience that you are still alive right now reading this, rather than, say, electrocuted to death by a rapid increase in strength of electric fields beginning uncaused around you. Thus, contrary to Carrier, error 64, there is no way the Tollens of my argument can fail that is inductively related. At 39 minutes 17 seconds of the video, Carrier states, his Locke's argument proceeds to, if the causal principle was ever not true, then even now we should constantly see random things popping into existence everywhere. Well, this is not a prediction of the hypothesis. Before the causal principle applied, the causal principle didn't apply, but once it gets cause to exist, then it applies. In reply, Carrier's claim that this is not a prediction of the hypothesis is based on his repeated failure to consider reasons 1, 2, and 3, which imply that if the causal principle was ever not true, i.e., if something X begins uncaused as Carrier, not me, postulates, then we should constantly see things, e.g., Y, beginning uncaused around us. This would imply it is not the case that the causal principle would apply now or ever, given which it cannot be the case that the causal principle gets cause to exist, contrary to Carrier's claims, error 65. At 40 minutes 9 seconds of the video, Carrier states, we are in a principled property at space-time, so we're in an ordered space-time that is controlling what can and cannot happen, so the causal principle applies now. We do not expect to see random rabbits and all this stuff, because we live now in an ordered space-time. But the whole point is, like if the principle didn't apply before it applied. In that point, your rabbits should be popping into existence. Now here where we are, there's a principled, ordered space-time that limits what can happen and limits it in specific ways, like quantum mechanics. Even spontaneous quantum mechanics and stuff is limited in very specific ways. In reply, of course we are now living in ordered space-time. This is premise 2 of my modus tollens argument. But stating this observation does not rebut the 3 reasons I explained for premise 1 of my modus tollens argument, which implies that if something ever begins uncaused, there would not in fact be any principled ordered space-time that controls or limits what can happen in such a way that prevent uncaused beginnings from happening now. In other words, Carrier is repeating error 6 and error 45, failing to understand what it means for something to be prevented from happening, which I have already explained to him in my earlier replies. To explain it again here, Carrier had previously objected to my modus tollens argument by claiming that we should expect to observe AEI beginning uncaused when there is nothing to stop it, but we should not expect to observe AEI when there is something to stop it. As there is, ordered space-time now exists and thus limits what can appear or disappear or in any other way change. In reply, the first thing to ask is, how can anything be prevented from happening? Obviously, Y cannot be prevented by something else, X, acting on the existence of Y itself, since if Y has already existed, then it has not in fact been prevented by X. Therefore, in order for X to prevent Y from beginning to exist, X would have to either 1. Act on the conditions which are, causally, necessary for the beginning of Y, or 2. Act on the circumstances to make them incompatible with Y beginning to exist. For example, in order to prevent a moving battery-operated toy car from entering a room, I would have to either remove the causally necessary conditions, such as by removing the batteries, or act on the circumstance to make it incompatible with the event occurring, such as by filling the room with hard objects such that there is no space for the car to enter into. However, if our universe began uncaused, as Carrier postulates, what this implies is that 1. There is no causally necessary condition which makes it the case that only universe, rather than other things, begins to exist. 2. Additionally, any difference between universe and other things would be had by them in the concrete world only when they had already begun to exist. That is, before X begin to exist, and before Y begin to exist, there cannot be any unique properties of X and the unique properties of Y, which differentiate between them in the concrete world, such that the universe is not caused to begin to exist, but we-type thing is caused to begin to exist. Since there is no differentiation, they will be the same, i.e., there would be no difference between them, where the requirement for causally necessary condition is concerned. Moreover, 3. The circumstances around us have been shown to be such that they are compatible with the beginning of existence of, say, an increase in strength of electric field. Let this equals Y. Reasons 1, 2, and 3 jointly imply that the beginning of Y, uncaused, would not have been preventable. Now, Carrier argued against reason 2 by claiming that once there is something, the condition of nothingness no longer exists, and that the condition of nothing, from which X begins, and the condition of something, from which Y begins, is a difference between X and Y which exists prior to the beginning of X and Y. However, Carrier's claim confounds 1. The condition of nothingness from which X begins. This condition of nothingness does not require the existence of X, with 2. the properties of x. This requires the existence of x in order for x to have those properties. In the absence of x beginning to exist, there is no x that possesses these properties which differentiate x from y. Likewise, Carrier's claim confounds 1. The condition from which y begins. This condition does not require the existence of y. Indeed, it pre-exists y, and thus can exist without y's, with 2. The properties of y. This requires the existence of y in order for y to have those properties. Before y begins to exist, there is no y that possesses these properties which differentiate it from x. I was referring to 2 when I talked about the difference between x and y, and stated that the properties of x and properties of y would only be had when they already begun to exist. Whereas Carrier is referring to 1 when he talks about the difference between x and y, thereby missing the point of my argument and hence failing to rebut reason 2 as well as the conclusion, my argument which follows from reasons 1, 2, and 3. For a documentation of the rest of the 90 errors committed by Richard Carrier, click on the link to the document in the description of this video below.